Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. With me today is Mike Luoma. He is an author, a podcaster, photographer, videographer. And most importantly, why I asked him here today is because he's a researcher of ancient New England stone structures. So hang tight, and I will be right back with Mike. Hi, Mike. Thanks so much for joining tonight.
Hey, Susie, thanks for asking.
No problem. My honor, for sure. So, a little bit of backstory about why I reached out to you specifically is when I have been trying to learn more about some local sites, I got increasingly frustrated with what I was seeing on Google. You get conflicting information, and then you get information that doesn't quite add up logically. And it seems that some politics can sometimes be involved in archaeology. And along the road, I found your group, Ancient Stone Mysteries of New England, and that everyone in there seems to be very kind of well balanced and based in fact and science. And so I kind of look at that as, a good place to start. And I've kind of done some jumping off from there. But it has been a great resource for sure.
Oh, that's great to hear. I
Yeah.
started the group, end of 2020, and it's just grown, I think, because interest in the stonework has grown. And now there's over 25,000 people in there, but there's a good core of people who are doing active work, getting out there, looking at stone sites, and trying to get the word out that these things exist in the first place, which isn't always the easiest thing to do.
Right. And who built them as well. And, you still see debates. And like I told you the other day, I had seen a video and it was probably very well intentioned. I believe it was on TikTok of someone not too far from me talking about stone walls,
Mhm.
specifically in New England, and about how they were all built by colonists.
That is a common misconception, and I think it's a combination of Yankee lore, what people have passed down over the years. People have just assumed that these were built by colonists or settlers or sheep farmers from 1820 to 1850, as some insist. I'm in Vermont, so people sometimes attribute it all to sheep farmers in that small period of time. Now, what this doesn't take into consideration is that there is an indigenous stone building tradition in New England, and we know about this. It's documented even to the point where a group of archaeologists from Harvard or associated with Harvard dug up a stone wall built by indigenous people in the Flag Swamp in Marlborough, Massachusetts. This happened in the late 70s. And it's documented. You can look at, the actual research that was done, and they built a stone wall along the drip line of the rock shelter so that they could prop branches up against it. That's the assumption of the archaeologists who dug it up. Now, this is so little valued in Massachusetts archaeology that once they dug this up and documented it, it was blown up to make way for a highway, like access road. So those of you who know the story of that Flag Swamp rock shelter know this story. And it always strikes me that this isn't even mentioned when people are talking about the stonewall traditions of New England. We have documentation of a 4,000-year-old stone wall that was built, and to just decide that nothing ever came of that, which is evidently what you're deciding if you say, well, then there was no tradition until the settlers taught the Indians, as they called them, to build with stone. That's still a big mainstream position in Massachusetts archaeology and in New England archaeology. The idea that the Native Americans, the indigenous people of New England, didn't build with stone. And yet we have, actual evidence to the contrary. And as we've discovered over the last 50 or so years, it's a blended landscape. There is an indigenous element that goes back thousands of years, and it was built upon by settlers, by sheep farmers, by other people. So it's not one thing or the other. It's really just a blended landscape. And that's really the trick, is trying to figure out what's what.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned that specifically. So I'm from Lebanon, Connecticut, which is a small town on the eastern side of the state, and not much has changed there in the last 300 years. So we still had a lot of the stone walls. And I remember asking my mom when I was a kid who built the stone walls, and she told me it was farmers. But then, a few years ago, me and her went back because she lives in Florida now. I've moved away. And we were just kind of driving around town. And she mentioned something about, oh, those stone walls were built by slaves, right? And at the time, I didn't I didn't know how to process that, and I wasn't sure if it was correct either. But then I have heard that some farmers had indigenous workers that would help build the walls. And maybe they weren't so much as, paid workers, but forced workers. And that's where that kind of rumor got started. But what do you make of that story? My mom could not elaborate on. It was just something she had heard over the years.
Well, it's true in part. Some of those stone walls that were built for farmers back in those days were built by indigenous laborers or slave laborers from over in Africa. More predominantly, though, it was a mix of indigenous slaves and indigenous laborers, because some of the indigenous were actually pressed into slavery. And that's not something that you hear talked about a lot either, but that did happen. For the most part, though, they found that they couldn't keep indigenous slaves in New England. They'd ship them off to Barbados or somewhere else, because otherwise they'd escape and they'd be gone. So I think there is some truth to that. What your mom heard is in fact to some degree true, but it was also built by Narragansett stonemasons who worked, and were paid. There's also the story of all the walls on Martha's Vineyard were built by indigenous laborers who were paid by the farmers there, or paid in whiskey, because sometimes you get those sorts of sort of biased stories as well.
Yeah, we also had on our property what I think is a serpent effigy. So you have like these nice walls along property lines with 90-degree angles. But then we had this one weird one that was in the woods, and it was kind of, meandering or snaking. And then there was a huge piece of quartz towards one
Oh,
end, and then a big boulder, and it was pointing towards a natural spring.
that sounds very telltale.
Yes, and I did not put that together. I grew up, getting drinking water out of that spring in the summer. I did not put that together until, seeing people post pictures of the serpent effigies they see. And I said, oh, you know what? That's what that was.
Well, we're just not taught this. I grew up like a few houses down from an old stone row that I didn't even think about. We used to hang out at the end of it on our bikes. It was like the rocks, as we called it. And then as I started to get into this stuff about 5 years ago, memory came back of adults showing up at this stone wall and shooing us kids away because they wanted to take pictures and take a look at it. And this isn't far. I grew up near the Flag Swamp, actually, in Marlborough, about a mile away from it. So I wonder in my mind sometimes, were those like early NERA researchers in the 70s, were they Maver and Dix, the guys who wrote the book Manitou, which is really one of the fundamental tomes of this research. And this was, just two houses down from me, and it was a stone wall that I grew up near and didn't think anything about. Like you say, until you have kind of like your eyes opened a bit, you don't see these things, even though they are literally in your own backyard. I mean, I was talking about that in my group today, talking about the preservation of these sites. I think it's important people know these things can be literally in your own backyard.
Yeah, you can almost stumble over them in the woods here sometimes. They're all over the place once you kind of realize what you're looking at.
And I think once you realize what you're looking at too, you begin to see, okay, these are colonial because they look really orderly and neat, and they have kind of that 1/2 coursework, and then these with the more organic forms that actually maybe even have zoomorphic forms as part of the coursework. These are more likely to be indigenous work that goes further back. And some of them were adapted and later used by farmers and settlers and sheep farmers. So,
Yeah, and you mentioned sheep farmers, and I was listening to a podcast about Gungiwamp down in Groton,
mhm.
and um, that there was one guest that had been interviewed that said it was a sheep farm. We have evidence of it being a sheep farm. Why are we even talking about this? Well, yes, there's evidence that a sheep farm was there, but it was a continuously inhabited place. There's evidence of other things nearby it.
And then that's another, I think, one of the assumptions that we fight against in talking about ceremonial stone landscapes in New England is that people have an assumption that there was a pristine landscape, that there was no settled landscape before the Europeans arrived in 1492 and onward. But what we discovered as you go back and actually read some of those first European accounts is that this was like a kind of a settled garden, a cultivated garden in some ways. When they were first landing on the East Coast, they could see for miles because this was tended and cleared. And it wasn't a pristine wilderness. There were paths and highways, if you will, that were footpaths and ways of travel, but those went all across this country. Well, what's now this country. And to just ignore the fact that there were millions of people ranging over what's now North America for 12,000, 15,000 plus years just kind of flies in the face of facts. I mean, where's the science in that if you're just like, oh, we're just going to count what happened in the last 200, 300 years? Stuff before that doesn't really matter. It's like, no, 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 no. We now know this is a possibility. You have to take it into account. You can't just dismiss it. Or if you do, why?
Right. Yeah. And like America's Stonehenge, they've dated things, what is it, 4,000 years back at least there. And, we know people were in this area long before that. So, like the Bridgewater Triangle and Hockomock Swamp is kind of my area of expertise. And they've, found human remains that were 8,000 years old there.
Mm.
So, people have been here a very long time.
Well, the Yankee lore and those myths are so pervasive. When I first came to Vermont, I came to Vermont to go to college in the 80s. I'm kind of old. But and when I came up here, people who were my contemporaries who had gone to school in the 70s and early 80s were even taught up here that no Indians lived in Vermont. I mean, that's what the pervasive Yankee lore was for Vermont, is that no Native Americans, no indigenous people had lived here. And that actually flew in the face of facts as that it was already known. I mean, there were documented, settlements of Missisquoi and other places that were here and were well known about to the academic community. But this was like so, I don't know, it had permeated the culture of Vermont to the point where it was taught in schools. Kids were hearing this in school, and it simply wasn't true. And in the 1990s, because they were going to do a big highway project around the city of Burlington, which is up where I am, up in the northwest corner of Vermont near Lake Champlain, they began to have to do these assessments, these archaeological assessments, to see if there were any, sites or things that they had to be sensitive to as they were going to build this new highway loop around the city. And as they began to do these assessments, it wasn't a question of did they find anything. It was a fact that they had, just about everywhere they dug, they found something. And some of the finds went back to the Paleolithic era. Some of these were Paleo Indians, as they call them, living on the shores of what was then the Champlain Sea, which was a larger body of water than what's now Lake Champlain. And these people had like a maritime culture, an aspect to their culture where they were hunting maritime, and they had caribou hunting was part of their mix. And now we know about this, and we have evidence of continuous habitation in this area down through the centuries, down for thousands and thousands of years. And yet, if you were to talk to somebody from 1984 or 1985 in Vermont, and even talk to some of those people today who haven't learned anything since they were in high school, they would tell you, oh, yeah, no, Indians never lived up here. So it's very hard to fight against these kind of prejudices.
Yeah, I can see it coming from the wanting to avoid explaining why they aren't there anymore. And I think I know, my grandfather would find things even in the fields. We had a dairy farm, so they'd find things constantly. Um, no one ever talked about it though, even, when I was a kid. And there's a whole chunk of history too that skipped over. There were Europeans here before the pilgrims, and we don't learn that in school. And then in school too, you just learn, the pilgrims came, there was the first Thanksgiving, and then, 100 years later or so, we were a country. So there's a
Yeah, they
lot of things
do.
in history people don't want to talk about.
They skip over so much, and it's all a period of conquest, really, which people don't want to really face up to. We like to think that it was an empty land that people just moved into, that the Europeans just took over. And, there is an element of fact in that lie, because, as you were saying, people started coming over here in, the early part of the 16th century, early 1500s. You had explorers and traders coming over to what's now New England and Nova Scotia and, points north and south. And as they did, they were infecting the Native American population here with all kinds of European diseases that the folks over here had no resistance to because they hadn't encountered them before. So by the time the Pilgrims arrived, which is about 1620, about 100 years later, much like in the South with the Spaniards doing the same kind of thing, about 90% of the indigenous populations here were wiped out along the coastline. So as these Europeans arrived and these Puritans arrived on the East Coast, they were like, look at these empty villages. God has provided for us. And it's just really, I mean, it's like cringy now to read about and go, really? This is how it was interpreted? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I have a letter from my ninth great grandfather, who was the last governor of Plymouth Colony, saying, God wanted us to have this land because he killed everyone before we got here, basically, exactly like what you were saying. I found that and I said, oh man, I'm not my ancestors. It's fine. And I had to have a pep talk with myself. But that was just a humdinger to read that, people really thought that way.
Mm. I found out the area near where I grew up, that area near Marlborough in Hudson, Massachusetts, was called Whipsapennicky, which meant place of the great dying. It's like, you
Oh,
start to find out these things late in life. I never learned any of this stuff as a kid. Growing up, we weren't taught a whole lot about much of anything about the indigenous peoples of the area. Luckily, it's better now. I mean, you can go online and there are websites. One of the first websites I found about my hometown of Hudson and indigenous stuff was like a website teaching kids about the indigenous history of the area. I was like, oh, well, good. I'm glad this is taught now, because it wasn't, 20, 50 years ago.
yeah,
But
and it wasn't homogenous either. And I think that's interesting when you're looking at some of the stone structures specifically too. Like a lot of them look similar, and you can kind of tell colonial versus indigenous. But then once in a while, you see something that doesn't look like anything else. There is this one site, I think I've only seen it in one of your videos, where even to my untrained eye, I saw it and I was immediately like, that's different. That's something different. It was a tunnel, a stone tunnel in
mm,
Vermont somewhere. you had in one of your videos. And, you see like, the natural shaped boulders usually in rocks, but this one had like very rectangular, flat, huge stones at the entrance. And it just immediately looks different, even if you're not an expert by any means. That one I found super interesting. Do you have any beliefs on that? Was because these things, I could not go out and build a stone tunnel. You have to do a lot of trial and error, or have somebody teach you. So where does that kind of thing just come from?
Now that one, and I'm sorry if this is too mundane, but I think it actually was a stone culvert that was built to go under a highway or a railroad bed. And the reason I say that is where this stone tunnel is about 20 feet below where the modern roadway is now, as far as elevation goes.
Oh,
And
yep.
after the Great Flood of 1927 in Vermont, they rebuilt all the roadways about 20 feet higher up. So I think this is it's very cool looking, but I think it was is actually built probably late 1700s, early 1800s as part of a turnpike or part of a railroad.
That's why it looks so different. That would
That's
make
why it
sense.
looks so different. Yeah. But I
Yeah.
think the stones themselves seem to be quarried from what could be an indigenous site across that modern road. When you go up and over there, there's almost like a stone amphitheater. And part of it is like just, these rectangular chunks are taken out of it. You go, oh, well, I bet you those are down the hill there, built into that tunnel chamber. But
And there's also the stone chambers that have astronomical alignments too. Um, and you hear crazy theories about those. Being from Connecticut, I'm not far from Gungywamp, and a lot of people will say it's Celtic, which I just haven't seen anything that's convinced me of that ever. And then we have America's Stonehenge, and then some other calendar sites. Um, I don't see a reason why those couldn't just be indigenous people personally, but I don't know that much about it. Can you speak to that a little bit?
well, I think from my own experience of going into stone chambers and checking out a few, I haven't by any means done an exhaustive study, but I have some field experience going and checking these out. The ones I've come across all seem to be different. In other words, they're not necessarily the same thing reproduced over and over again. It's like um, more like there's different uses and different periods of time where these things were built. So I don't think they're any one time or any one period. Some of them strike me as possibly being indigenous, while others I look at and I think, yeah, I can see where there's, some of that regular construction, as I was talking about before, kind of like that regular coursework, 1/2, sort of European style coursework. When I see that, I start to think, well, this is probably a later chamber. And some of those were built because in New England during the winter they couldn't bury people. So they had to have these stone chambers and they'd keep the coffins in those stone chambers until they could put them in the ground once the ground thawed. So there's those kind of chambers. There are probably a handful of root cellars out there. Now, I don't think there were as many as were once thought, but I think, yeah, there is the possibility some of these could be used as root cellars. I've gone back and there is evidence that you can find of people writing about some of the stone chambers as possibly being sweat lodges for the indigenous people, where there's accounts of them using things that are like a cave to go into to do their ceremony. So that could be a possibility as well. I know for myself, when I first went into the Upton Stone Chamber, that one struck me as being something special. I mean, here's where I have to step outside of kind of a sort of objective, quasi scientific approach and say there was just something about that space that spoke to me. And in a bigger way than I can really encompass in regular words. It was a sense of place that was kind of momentous. And hard to pin down. And that was the place where I first went, could this stonework be indigenous? And I started to look into this, and that's where I started to discover all this side of things. Because up to that point, I had entertained all the, like, pop culture ideas. Oh, these were like, pre-Columbian European Phoenicians or Celts or something. And I should be kind and not disparage that too much, because there are people who are still investigating those kind of explorations as a possibility. But for me, as I delved into this more and more, it seemed like there was a real indigenous stonework tradition that's been ignored. And that's the root of all this, and not so much the other European stuff. So I think we see some of those stone chambers are possibly really ancient and indigenous in nature, but others I think were built at different periods of time for different reasons.
Yeah, and when you said the Phoenicians, I thought of Dighton Rock,
Mm.
out near the Cape. I know the Phoenicians are kind of on the list of suspects, so to say, for who did the inscriptions on that. But those inscriptions are so interesting. I don't know if we'll ever know for sure who did it, but I know Vermont has some stones with some inscriptions on it, or am I mistaken? I've confused Vermont and New Hampshire sometimes, admittedly.
There are petroglyphs down in southern Vermont, in Bellows Falls area. I haven't actually seen those because I'm based in the other part of the state, but those are quite well known, and those have been studied. And I think somebody at one point carved them back out a little bit, like actually went back over them. So I'm not sure that they are in the condition that people would hope they were. Um,
Are those the ones that kind of look like humanoids?
yeah, they look like emoticons almost.
Yeah,
Round faces and oh,
those were the ones I was thinking.
yeah, they look like singing people perhaps. And that could be what they are doing. They could be singing like the water is singing as it's going through the stones next to the river.
Yeah, those are super interesting. You don't see that a whole lot around here anyway.
No, and I saw something earlier. Well, I think it was later, or the later part of last year, where they uncovered some that were very similar down in the Amazon. So it's like, I think there's I'm not saying they're connected. I'm saying there's probably like a commonality of expression that's come out from indigenous people, looking at faces and wanting to draw a face on a stone. And that's how it comes out, is by, the process of working on hard stone. You can't do that much with it. So it's going to look a certain way.
And humans aren't all that different across different areas and periods of time. So it's not too surprising.
And I think that's what you see working with the stone chambers too. To circle back on that, I think it's there's stone. We got a bunch of stones here. We need to build something, and let's build this and put some big slabs on the top, and we can use that for a while.
And people did travel, like you were saying earlier. There were roads and paths, and I think a lot of people, the idea is that these people just stayed in their villages and didn't go too far. But no, you might go seasonally. A lot of these people travel to, you might, encounter a structure, get an idea from that even, and,
Mm.
take it home and make your own version.
It's interesting. The indigenous peoples almost seem to have become less mobile over time. Like, you look at the Paleo Indians, and they traveled enormous distances without giving it a thought. A lot of times, what we're seeing now is that they did maritime travel, so they were traveling on the lakes, the rivers, and even the oceans around the coastlines. And then, like, through the archaic and the woodland period, you see a lot of trade going on still across the Americas, what we now call the Americas. And there are trade goods in Vermont that come from Ohio and points further south, and vice versa. And it's only like in the late woodland period that you start to see things kind of slow down. And there's kind of a breakdown in the localization of things. And there's less and less trade going on, but more localized trade. So there's less, like, great distance trade. But before that, like we were talking about, these people shared a lot of ideas. There was a lot of cultural sharing, and sometimes they'll talk about different arrowheads as being kind of like it'll tell you a lot about who the people are. But sometimes I wonder about that as well, because they're sharing so much. They may have just been sharing the technology and not necessarily the culture. So I think there's a whole interesting bed of worms there that can be delved into as well. The idea of just how substantial that trade and exchange was.
Yeah, and so from my folklore studies, even words kind of got traded too. Like pukwudgies specifically, that's an Ojibwa word, but you hear it in from the Wampanoag tribe in Southeast Mass and also in Indiana too. So they have very similar folklore, but that varies a little bit, but they use the same words. They all spoke Algonquian, but with slight variances, but that particular word, and I'm sure there's more, kind of carried over. So they were definitely, in communication with people across, greater distances than I even like to travel today sometimes.
Hmm. Well, I think the Ojibwa and the Eastern Algonquin tribes are there's an interesting connection there, because the Ojibwa also used to say that they came from the East, but the anthropologists were like, no, no, no. Indigenous came, west to east, so no, no, no. But now we know, yeah, they probably did. They probably migrated back that way after a period of time, and you even see that with some of the legends, like they have stories about the Great Beaver blocking Lake Superior as opposed to the Great Beaver blocking Lake Hitchcock in New England. But there's a commonality to that story that underlies it that makes you go, okay, there's some shared mythology here, or shared history, because we now know there were giant beavers. So it's interesting to see the connections there, and like you say, how are these traded? How are the words traded as well as the goods, and how is the stonework, how were the ideas of doing things in stone traded? I before I got into New England stonework, I was looking at the mounds and the earthworks in the Midwest, and that's what I was studying. I was looking into Serpent Mound in Ohio, and the Newark earthworks, the octagon and the circle there, and it was kind of wild to realize I had been looking over what was here in New England to look at the stuff in the Midwest, and finally had to recalibrate my vision and look in my own backyard.
Yeah, it is different because, Serpent Mound's a great example. You have a lot of mounds out in that direction, and we know indigenous people built them. That's, kind of common knowledge. But then you come to New England and people are saying, "Oh no, indigenous people didn't build with stone." And there's that resistance to even admit it could be a possibility. It's very interesting, just the difference between the two regions.
It's interesting if you go to like a place in Ohio like Fort Ancient, and you see the stonework there, and the Ohio archaeologists tell you, well, it's clean because it was probably ritual stonework. So they didn't do things like eat or have war around here. They wouldn't have had arrowheads. You wouldn't have found cultural goods. It's clean. And in New England, they go, well, you see, that's not Indian stonework because it's clean, because they weren't around it. It's like, well, wait, no, in Ohio, they say this opposite thing. Whereas
Yeah.
here, they say this thing. And so it's they say it's just context. But I think that there's certain blinders that are on that don't allow them to see those kind of things.
Yeah, and I've heard from other people that sometimes state archaeologists will come in seemingly having some kind of agenda that they have to push and kind of, disregarding a lot of things there. And that's very disheartening to hear that there's, any politics involved in archaeology at all. Um, and I get upset because as a kid, those were like the people I looked up to, you know, and to hear that is just upsetting. And I know it's just, one person here and there, and it's not everybody. Um, but it's so frustrating.
But yeah, I mean, when you read the United South and Eastern Tribes resolutions, the like 30 or so groups of indigenous peoples federally recognized tribes who got together in this association. They're called the United South and Eastern Tribes, and they put out resolutions on the ceremonial stonework. And I believe it's the one in 2007 that they put out that they addressed to federal authorities because they felt that state historical preservation officers and state archaeologists were threats to the stonework and weren't actually helping to preserve it because they were dismissing it all as byproducts of agriculture. So the tribes themselves have come out in resolution form and said, please help us preserve these sites because some of these people in these positions of power, these archaeologists or historic preservation officers, have been instrumental in working against us. Now that's kind of sad. And I know some archaeologists who are pro or at least open to the idea of ceremonial stone landscapes have dismissed some of their colleagues for these assumptions that they work under and called it scientism. And scientistic, but not actual science. I'm thinking of Curtis Hoffman, who wrote the book Stone Prayers. Curtis often dismisses people as being scientistic and engaging in scientism because they're not actually basing their assumptions on science, but rather on, well, Yankee lore, as we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I know, I think it was quite a while back, but the Mohegan tribes had to stop a highway from being built over a site, and they were successful, but it was, I I know about it because it was supposed to be where their little people lived, but there was a
Ah,
lot of stone structures in that area as well. So I don't know how much of it has to do with little people and their, belief system with that or them trying to protect their sites in general. But I was very glad that they stopped that from going through because a lot of that part of the state has been it used to be, even when I was a kid, it looked completely different before the casinos were built and highways built to get people to the casinos. So I was just glad that they got, at least that one spot preserved for them.
mm. Yeah, those casinos are double-edged swords. They've done a lot for the indigenous economies, but at the same time, the development that's occurred has been somewhat disturbing. Although I know in building Foxwoods, they did make some significant archaeological discoveries as part of doing digs beforehand, before they did disturb things. And I know some of that was chronicled in Ted Timmerich's movies. I was just watching or rewatching The Great Falls, which was one of Ted Timmerich's movies, and he chronicled some of that and some of what occurred. I think it was in Great Falls, but at any rate, his hidden landscape movies did talk about some of the archaeology that's been done because of the casinos. So there's been,
Yeah,
like I say, good and bad.
they have some artifacts at the museum there too that they found, I believe, during the building of it.
But I didn't realize how extensive the stonework was down in that region until I got invited to go down to like North Stonington, Connecticut, or Hopkinton, Rhode Island, and see some of the extensive stonework sites that are down in that area. And that was Narragansett territory. They're still known for their stonework. Their stonemasons have been known for stoneworking throughout history. So it's remarkable to see what's still there, even in that neck of the woods.
Yeah, and like I was saying before, we used to see just odd piles of stones in the woods, never really thought twice about it. I don't know, your kids, I guess you're not really thinking, "How did that pile of stones get there?" But now, "How did that pile of stones get there?"
And I think it's important that we acknowledge there is an agricultural heritage that did stack some stones and did do some stone walls, and that's legit. We have to acknowledge that. But in acknowledging that, I want to ask those who engage in their own speculation on the origins of the stone walls and decide it's all Yankee work or settler work or whatever, European work. I want them to do the same. That's what I would like them to do, is also accept the possibility that this is indigenous work and that there is an underlying layer of cultural significance that they need to deal with. I'm willing to say, look, I know a lot of this is European on top of something else. Can you be willing to acknowledge the something else is there?
Yeah, and I've seen fields get plowed and the rocks that come out of those. So yes, anytime you clear an area here, you're going to end up with a pile of rocks somehow.
Yeah, I'm not denying that. There are some people who are like, oh, it's all indigenous, and I can't go there either. It's like, no, it can't be. There have been Europeans building with stone here for many hundreds of years, a couple hundred years. That is significant as well. So I don't know. We have to be open to that if we're going to be, I think, realistic about looking at what's out there. But then we have to be realistic and say, look, there's indigenous stuff here too. And I would say in the case of those folks that didn't build that highway you're talking about, that they're lucky, because you don't want to be pissing off those pukwudgies.
Oh no, absolutely not. Nope.
One thing you learn about the little people is you don't mess with them.
Right. It's just like short people. We're fine as long as you leave us alone.
But it's interesting you mentioned the Ojibwe, because I've read some of Thor Conway's books, and he talks a lot about rock art. And in that, he's also relating a lot of stories of Ojibwe elders talking about many of the little people that are up there, and not just pukwudgies, but they have different names and different
Mhm.
categorizations of them. And they all are very much tied into the rock work.
They are. Yeah. That's how I can't say that's how I got into the stonework because like I said they were fascinating to me when I was little. But when I was researching pukwudgies and even like going up to the Hockomock swamp, there's stonework everywhere. And then you start branching out and looking into little people lore in other areas and like the Indiana pukwudgies, those are around Mound State Park. And there's also any kind you time you have like ceremonial type places, that's where this lore pops up. It's very interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting aspect that you don't hear talked about as much as far as the ceremonial stone landscape stuff goes, because I think people are trying to be serious, if you will, about CSL work, and at the same time they feel that that might be either less than serious or might be insensitive. You don't want to at the same time insult indigenous people by talking about an aspect of culture that they might not want you to be talking about.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, there's
So,
a fine line there for sure.
and I think there's a fine line with this stuff in that aspect anyway. It's
Hmm.
it's always it's always I- and I think this is maybe one of the biases some of us have when we first get into this that we don't realize we have, is the idea that this is past stuff, that this is all in the distant past. And then you begin to discover, no, the indigenous people are still here. And they'd like you to know that. And
Hmm.
and then you begin to realize I can't be talking about this stuff as if it's all just our ancient stuff. Although I do specify I'm talking about the ancient stone mysteries of New England. I think there is an element of realizing that this culture still exists, these people are still here, and we best not forget that. We need to acknowledge that. As we become more aware of the stonework, we should become more aware of the people as well, I think.
Yeah, if you go to the cemetery on the Wampanoag Reserve, there are brand new stone prayers there. Yeah, you could tell the difference between a new one and an old one. It's still they're still here.
And sometimes you just don't know, and um, up here in Vermont, some of the work I think has been covered for a long time. In Massachusetts, I think we see more active ceremony has continued because some of the stonework seems to have been kept cleaner. Whereas in some of the places I find the stonework in Vermont, it hasn't, and it's covered by a lot more duff, and um, it just is, I think, more evident that there are places where there is still more active ceremony going on.
Yep. There's one topic that seems to become very heated sometimes, and that is perched boulders.
Ah,
I have seen many an argument about perched boulders. Um, and this kind of is similar in my mind to sometimes it's colonial and sometimes it's indigenous, except this time you replace the colonists with the glacier. Um,
that's a good
but
way to
there,
put it.
but there's what are the chances of a glacier leaving all of those? Is the It just seems improbable to me. Sure, some of them, um, but they don't all look the same. Also, and some of them have other things nearby that were
I
definitely made.
I think again it's the pristine wilderness argument. If you believe it was a pristine wilderness, then you can have things that stood like that since the Ice Age or since shortly after. And you can make an argument that, yeah, there were these boulders on top of all kinds of mud and ice, and the substantial amount of it melted away, and just the biggest rocks kept it in place. I think that's a legit geological theory. Um, and I think it does explain a lot of them. But I think it also might explain why we see them. It's like if you were an indigenous person and you saw this, you might want to recreate it yourself. Um, that doesn't seem that far fetched to me. And if you saw it as something that was like miraculous or a sign of, you know, the creator doing something, you might want to pay tribute by doing it yourself. So I think that to argue that they're all glacial erratics flies in the face of, 13,000 years of habitation and the idea that this was not a pristine wilderness. I don't think you can have people living here by the millions for that long a period of time and say, no, these things were left here since the Ice Age and nothing's changed since that time. I think it flies in the face of reason.
I can't imagine coming across one of those in the woods without having Google to tell me what's going on. Because if you just saw one of those, whether, it was left by a glacier or it was made intentionally, that is crazy to see. Some of those are just amazing that they have been standing this long with all the crazy weather, getting earthquakes here now too, which is fun. But it's almost mind blowing them lasting 100 years or a year even. Some of them look so crazy.
Well, I think we see the worst tendencies of people in the modern day, we see people knocking over things, and vandalizing these perched or pedestal boulders, or even if they are just glacial erratics. Why are you doing this? But people do it. If people have that tendency now, we are all pretty much the same people as far as like biology goes to those people who were here 13,000 years ago. Maybe a little subtly different, but not that much different. And I'm sure that there were bad people back then who would have done a similar thing to any glacially perched boulder. So over the course of time, again, I think that, the argument just, I think it's yes, that these all could have been left in place by the glaciers. We know that glacial melting and action, and the way that the ice caps move and the ice sheets melt, we know that this is possible. These could have all been left this way. Parsimoniously, I don't think you can argue for that when there have been people here for that long since. And I know that I've proposed some things that I've said, could these things, this rock formation, have been in place since the Ice Age? Could this be a fin-shaped stone that we see repeated in form on the edges of Lake Champlain? And I've had some geologists say, well, stuff from the Ice Age doesn't stand up that long. You couldn't have something like that because it wouldn't have lasted since the Ice Age. And I'm like, well, what about your rocks? What about your glacial erratics? How have those lasted this long? If my thing can't have lasted this long. So I don't know. To me, the argument is yes, it could have, but I don't think that means that everything has been that way. I think geology over-explained in especially the 19th century when you had people saying things like there were no Indians in Vermont. So anything we saw in Vermont had to be explained geologically. You know, if you have one thing and you're setting the basis for another science based on these suppositions that aren't necessarily correct, you might not have the strongest basis for some of those suppositions.
Yep. I will give the glaciers credit for a certain type of cool stone we have in New England, which is the pudding stones.
Okay.
Have you ever encountered one of those?
I haven't, because you don't see them that much up here in Vermont. We see more gneiss up here than anything else. And here in Burlington, we see a bunch of dolostone. But I've seen examples of pudding stone, and that's the conglomerate, isn't it?
Yeah. There's one in Fall River that's enormous, and then there's another one which it's Rehoboth, I think, it's Anwan's Rock, and it's enormous itself. And you see it in pictures or videos, but it doesn't do it justice until you're there in real life. And it looks like river rocks in cement
Mm.
almost, but it's absolutely huge. And it's just so fascinating. From what I understand is they believe those came from possibly as far as Greenland, were brought down by the glaciers. Not sure exactly. That's what I've read. But those, I love those. I'm so glad the glaciers brought those here. I don't think those were man-made at all, so we can definitely give those to the glaciers, I think.
Yes, glaciers did do some amazing things, and they are responsible for a lot of the landscape and the topography of New England because of the glacial till that was left behind as the glaciers melted. And that's why there can be erratics here, and that's why you do see so many misplaced boulders. I mean, those are really glacial erratics. Misplaced boulders that you see all over the place, whether pudding stones or otherwise. A lot of them don't come from this area or were carried some distance from the north. And just as things melted, they kind of just stayed and the ice went away. Um, but as for the ones that are perched up, yeah, I have my doubts as far as like how many are actually left from the glaciers melting.
Yeah. Once in a while, you'll be driving down a back road here and you'll see an out of place boulder. And a lot of times they've been painted to look like something. Like there is a frog and an eagle near me.
And if they look like that to us, what did they look like to other people that were physiologically just like us 1,000 years ago? It's not that far fetched to think that some of these boulders may have been seen as different effigy creatures. And I think there's a case to be made for that as well, even if it is a subjective case.
Yeah. It's like the old man on the mountain in New Hampshire. We used to love going there as kids, and now it's gone.
Mm.
But,
I did get to see
everyone
that
saw this.
once as a kid. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a big tourist attraction, or it was.
it was. Yeah, that was a sad one too.
And I think they had tried to shore it up with like rebar and cement and things too. But gravity, it's not just a good idea, it's the law. So,
Yep. And I
uh,
mean, that was one stone that didn't last forever, so we know, I mean, like you were saying, what are the chances of a perched boulder being left here by the glaciers to begin with, but then surviving over all those years the way it was.
And I think there just needs to be an acknowledgement that there were people here who could have done stuff.
Yes.
You just don't really get that. You don't get that with a lot of the different sciences, and so that's part of the education too, I guess, is trying to get people to realize that there were a lot of people here over a long period of time, because there's just that sense, especially here in New England, of nobody was here before us. And
Yeah.
yeah, you really got to break that sort of Yankee lore. I don't know that I lump it all under that terminology, because it is kind of like a certain headspace that says, we were the first, and we're the rugged individuals, and it's almost like you're insulting the Yankee culture if you insist that there was a tradition of indigenous stone building. It's like, no, I'm not trying to insult anybody's culture. I'm just trying to say there was another culture, and then this culture, and we
And
need
some of
to.
the work that we know is, you know, very, very old. The first Europeans to come here were just barely getting by. They were
Yes.
not doing well at first. And I don't think, especially if you're just here exploring, you're not going to, take a month off from your explorations to build an elaborate stone chamber. And if you're a colonist that's barely surviving, you're not going to put all that effort into that either. So
Okay.
the stone
Yeah.
walls were functional. It makes sense that a colonist would put effort into that if they needed it or if there was a reason for it. But I don't even think they had the energy to expend up until a certain point in time. It just doesn't. It makes much less sense to me.
There's a total like left field sort of conspiracy idea that I've been entertaining, and I don't have any proof of this, but it also makes me wonder. So many of the people in power who were settling in the New World, as they called it, were also Masons. And part of the idea of being a Mason is that it made you superior. And the idea that you worked
Oh,
with stone made you superior. For them to acknowledge that indigenous people actually did work with stone might have been a leap too far for some of those Masons. They might not have been able to acknowledge that, because it would have been acknowledging a superiority in this race of savages whose land they were stealing. And I just wonder how much that aspect of things played into it. Could these Masons not allow for these indigenous people they're talking to actually be stone builders, because it flew in the face of the idea that masonry and stonework came down from the temple in Jerusalem and all the way down, and could never have been given to these savages unless they met tribes of Israel or something along the way. Um, I wonder how much that sort of cultural, I guess cultural blinders, those kind of cultural blinders that Masons would have had, would have kept them from giving any credence to the idea that these indigenous people were building with stone.
it makes a whole lot of sense for sure.
And it's just conjecture on my part, but I'm thinking that it is an element that's probably present that we should probably think about as well.
Yeah, yeah. We just need to think about things more. I think in general.
That would be nice. Boy, I wish people thought about things.
Yeah. So, before we wrap up, if anyone is interested in reading more, watching more, learning more about the work that you do, where can they find you?
Well, I have a site, ancientstonemysteries.com, which has links to pretty much everything, because I have a YouTube channel where I do videos about sites I go to. I have a Facebook group, as we were mentioning at the start of things, where people can post pictures and ask questions, and and share what they find. Um, I also have my book, Ancient Stone Mysteries of New England. I wrote this because I figured not everybody's online, and maybe this will reach some people who aren't online that might want to learn more. And this is available now also as an ebook and as an audiobook too. So it's available in a few different formats. And there's also a Substack newsletter that I do to get the word out, and articles I post on Medium as well. So I'm always trying to kind of educate people to the idea that this stuff is actually here, that this is a possibility, because most people still don't know that there is possible indigenous stonework here in New England.
And it's some of it's pretty beautiful too.
Yeah, once you start to see it. I love the thing I see a lot in stone rows are surrounded stones, where you see one stone that's kind of round or rhomboidal in the middle, and you'll see there's an arrangements of stone around it. And I've seen these in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, in Vermont. It seems to be a repeated motif. Up here in Vermont, though, I see most of the times the center stone is quartz, which is really neat. Some of the stones I've seen up on like mountainsides have these surrounded stones with quartz in the middle. And I've seen that in one or two places around New England, but more predominantly up here for some reason. But
And
yeah,
the
beautiful.
lace work stone walls, those are just amazing to me. I would not be able to do that myself. I think that's why it's amazing to me. They're just gorgeous.
Now I see more of that in your neck of the woods down in that Connecticut area than we see up here in Vermont. Up here I don't see quite so much of that, although there is some. In Vermont, it generally seems to be kind of almost a thicker work. And again, I think, indicative of the fact that these were different people doing similar work, but in different places. Massachusetts seems to be a crossover. I've seen lace walls there and some of kind of what I call this thicker Vermont style stuff there too. So it could be that's, where watersheds met and different nations kind of did different things and shared technology as well.
Yeah, Massachusetts does seem to be quite a mixed bag, even from, one side of the state to the other, but even having there's a lot of stone sites in Massachusetts, not that there isn't in Connecticut or Vermont, but
Mm.
definitely some more famous ones in Massachusetts.
Yeah, it's almost as if it runs up that Neshoba Ridge that 495 kind of runs along these days. But I think that's maybe why some of the stonework was preserved over time, was just because it was some of the hilliest, less accessible land. It ended up being the highway corridor because of that. Because it wasn't used land, and I think that we still see around the highways in Massachusetts some of these stone sites because it accidentally got preserved by the highways going through, or because it was less than accessible or less than you know uh, land people didn't want.
Yeah. And if you join the Facebook group and look at all these pictures every day, you'll start to see them everywhere once you know what you're looking for.
I do. I think it permeates New England. I really do. I mean, I think there are places where it's really prominent, but it's almost in every backyard.
Yep. Yep. It definitely was in mine for sure.
And just down the road from me. So
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, I think we just proved that point fairly well. All right, Mike, thank you very much for joining me. I had a great time talking about rocks on a Friday night
Yeah,
with
this is fun. I'm always loving to talk about um, well, the ancient stone mysteries of New England is an easy way to put it. So, but I love to talk about the idea that there is this heritage that we just don't know about until you start to learn for yourself.
yeah, there is so much to learn just about New England that in every aspect of it than you would ever imagine when you start really looking into it.
Yeah, it doesn't seem that far fetched to find out that there's a stone building tradition that you never heard of when you begin to realize, well, I never heard about the 100 years between the Pilgrims and the Revolution either.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
it starts to become obvious we haven't heard a lot. So it doesn't seem that far fetched to me once you begin to learn what we haven't learned,
Yep.
that there is
And
a stone building tradition as well.
and Connecticut had witch trials too. It wasn't just Salem.
No,
There's
really?
mysteries under around every corner.
Indeed. Indeed. Well, thank you again for inviting me and having me on to talk about this stuff because, as I say, it's fascinating to me too.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And I hope that my normal viewers might not be too into New England stone mysteries, or not as much as I am anyway. But I think this will kind of maybe reach a few new ears and eyes, and they'll understand why I geek out on stone walls so much.
Well, let's hope we've made some new converts. I would love
Yeah.
that.
Again, thank you, Mike, for joining. It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you